Hello friends, my name is Whiteness, and today I'll be talking about all of the books that I read last month. I posted a video at the very beginning of 2020 talking about some of my reading goals this year, and I referenced back to that one because of the way that I'm going to break down this wrap up. So starting with the fact that I want to read 2 books of the month every month in order to account for the fact that on the shelf going across this way, it's like all book of the months basically. I rearranged my shelves a little bit so now you can actually see them. I love book of the month. I get so excited about picking out a book. Sometimes I get so excited I buy more than one book. I'm not very good at keeping on top of reading them, which is why I ended up with so many unread books of the month on my shelf. So I'm trying to cut back on that. So what I figure is that if I get a new book, then I have to read 2 books in that month in order to account for the new one that I got and an additional one off my shelves. First up, I read The Proposal by Jasmine Guillory. This is a romance novel that is the second in sort of a related series. I read The Wedding Date last year and I really enjoyed it. And in this one, a woman gets proposed to at a baseball game, kind of like in front of everybody, but it takes her off guard. She doesn't want to get married to this man that proposed to her. They've only been dating for a short amount of time, and so she refuses him publicly. And a man who happens to be at the game as well with his sister sees that she is kind of being pressed in on by the crowd. The cameras are coming, so they decide to help her and save her and get her out of there. And then that kind of starts the relationship between the main character and the guy who saved her. As the story progresses, the main conflict between Nick and Carlos is their own willingness to be in a relationship. So if that is something you like or dislike, just be aware that the conflict is very internal. I was kind of hot and cold on that. I liked it because it meant that this was very low angst and low friction. They were just dealing with their own internal feelings, but also that kind of hinges on them communicating. And there were a couple of times where they were communicating past each other, which is always something that frustrates me in fiction for in and out of story reasons. Not that it was badly done here, like I understand why they were talking past each other, but it was also kind of like, come on, get it together. I really enjoyed the friend groups that surrounded the 2 main characters. I loved Nick's friends and seeing a group of friends that were women of color, and there were so many mentions of food and cupcakes and just delicious things in this book. It is always great when you can tie a sense that way very strongly to a book, and here it was definitely like taste and just reading about these things. It was so delicious. On the flip side of that, I did think that some of the dialogue was a little stilted and sometimes cheesy. There were scenes where the characters were clearly having fun and like laughing at whatever was happening, but they would go on too long, and also I wouldn't think it was funny. So it was kind of like, you know, when people are laughing but you're not in on the joke and it gets annoying. I experienced that a couple of times while I was reading this. I did think it was also a little bit too long. Another part about having the internal conflict is that they kept thinking things over and over and repeating sort of that like, does he understand? Do I want to do this so much? Just it wore on me. It just reached a point where I was like, okay, that's enough. Had this been shorter and tightened a little bit, that would have been great, and had some of the dialogue not been as cheesy or stilted, it would have been perfect. As it was, I gave this 3 out of 5 stars. The second book of the month book that I picked was my January 2020 pick, and that is Things in Jars by Jess. This is a mystery of sorts. It's set in Victorian London. It does have a fantastical element in it, and the story is led by Bridie Devine, who is a widow and an investigator of sorts. She gets pulled in or called in by the police because she's very good at finding people and things, and also at examining dead bodies and kind of like picking apart clues and details from there. So Bridie gets called into this case, but also at the same time she realizes that she can see and talk to a ghost, which has never happened to her before. And so this mystery is definitely layered, I felt like. So there was the thing that I thought we were investigating, but then it's like, ghost? Why ghost? And then you're also dipping back into Bridie's past and trying to piece that into or see how it informs the current mystery. I loved Bridie so much. I thought that she was just a great character. She wasn't like entirely unique, but I don't know. At the helm of a Victorian London like mystery, she was great with her pipes and her smoking and her little found family around her, even though she had a really rough start to her life. And then just sort of like the way that she starts to accept things. At first she's like, I don't believe in ghosts, but she sees one and she's like, okay, I believe in ghosts. I love that. I hate when characters go on for too long saying like they don't believe in a thing that they're actually experiencing. So that was great. I will say that even though I got the physical copy, I ended up borrowing a copy, an audiobook copy from the library, and I listened to it on audiobook, which I'm not sure if that was the correct way to do it. I followed everything through fine, like I felt like I was enjoying it and understanding it, but it is a suspect heavy mystery. So had I been reading it, it would have been easier for me to flip back and just kind of remind myself who everyone was. That was a little more difficult while I was listening to it. It is very description heavy. It is very atmospheric, which I appreciated the atmosphere of like the spooky gothic Victorian London with some fantasy in it, with some fantastical elements. But I did think that this was also a little bit too long and overly descriptive. It went on sometimes in a really wordy way that I feel like the thread of the mystery kind of got lost. Overall, I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. Another one of my goals is to read 1 nonfiction book a month, and I actually read 3 nonfiction books this month. The first is I'm Still Here, Black Dignity in a World Made for Whiteness by Austin Channing Brown. This is a collection of essays by Brown, clearly about being a Black woman. She takes you through like school and being a Black woman in her professional life, and then she also talks a lot about working within the church and just kind of her faith and being a Black woman within that structure as well. I love this so much. It has a really clear and concise voice, and it wasn't necessarily like so life-changing, or it didn't really teach me anything brand new, but seeing from Brown's perspective and hearing it in her voice and just like I said, such a clear, concise way was really impactful. And I also didn't expect that this would tackle issues of faith. So just hearing her experience about being a Black woman, but also working within the church, and how there were still microaggressions and things that she had to face in that arena was really, really wonderful to hear. I love the way that Brown was able to balance just being very honest and hard-hitting, but also hopeful and full of love. It was ultimately something that I feel was realistic and grounded, but also didn't leave me feeling bad at the end of it. I felt like there was hope for future generations of Black women. I ended up giving this 5 out of 5 stars. Next up is Brown Girl Dreaming by Jacqueline Woodson. This is a memoir of her early life told in verse. It worked on all of those levels. It worked as a childhood memoir, it worked as a memoir, and it worked as a story told in verse. I think it is so impressive the way that Woodson was able to capture like a very childlike voice, but still weave together this super simplistic but beautiful verse. I got emotional a couple of times while reading this. Anytime that I have a reminder of how close in our history that our country is to Jim Crow, the Jim Crow era, it just is something that is super impactful. And Woodson was born just after the end of the Jim Crow laws, and you see the way that that affects her growing up experience in the South. It's always very difficult to rate nonfiction in general, but especially about something as personal as a memoir, especially a memoir of someone's childhood experience and experience growing up and navigating a school system and finding what they're talented at and forming lifelong friendships. Like, it was just so, it's so personal, very beautiful. Ultimately, there were times where it felt easier to put down and not come back to immediately, which I know is just kind of vague, and I couldn't put my finger on it more than that, but I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. The third nonfiction book that I read was You Never Forget Your First by Alexis Coe. This is a biography of George Washington, and it is framed around this idea of taking a look at how we've talked about George Washington, or biographers have talked about George Washington in the past, and sort of the legend that is built up around him, but also kind of acknowledging that women aren't often history writers or biographers, or haven't been, of George Washington in the past. So Coe talks a lot about that, and also about the women in Washington's life and the way that they have been framed by these male biographers in the past. This is a super breezy biography. I feel like if you want something a little bit more in-depth, this is not for you. We skip over almost entirely the revolution. Like, she just gives highlights and keeps on moving. So again, this is not like something that you're going to go into for something that is like super in-depth on Washington's entire life and career. There were moments where it was really funny and the voice was great, and there were moments where I personally hit my like limit of I'm not a regular biography, I'm a cool biography. But in general, I really appreciated the way that she never let us forget the women in Washington's life, and also the idea of like every time Washington achieved something, she also checked in with the slaves that made it possible. Coe never lets us forget that Washington gets credited for freeing his slaves, which he didn't really do until like he did it in his will, and he kind of forced Martha to do it after he was dead. So it's something that we give him credit for that, you know, does he deserve credit for that? I guess read the book and find out. But this was, like I said, really breezy, really easy to read, very entertaining, and it made me interested to perhaps read a couple more Washington biographies this year and start delving a little bit deeper into presidential biographies, especially because I feel like I will read them a little bit differently after reading Coe's writing and kind of hearing her talk about the way that we frame history and how we can see like a fact and then the biographer's interpretation of that fact. I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. Another one of my goals is to read more short stories and sci-fi. Last month I read a collection of short stories, and this month I read a collection of short stories. I read The World Doesn't Require You by Rion Amilcar Scott. This is a collection of short stories that all centers around a fictional town that is supposed to be the place of the first like successful slave uprising, and so you kind of jump around in time a little bit. It's not very clear, but it feels like some things are in the past and some things are in the future, but it all revolves around the legacy of that slavery uprising in this one fictional town. This collection, I feel like I was truly reading something that was well written and super brilliant, and there were some stories that they were dense and very just impactful, and they left me reeling a little bit. And then there were other stories that I was entirely sure I was not fully understanding, or that were shocking me to a point where I wasn't really fully processing the message behind kind of what was placed in front of my face. It's always really difficult, I think, to say I did not understand this book, but there was a portion of this book that I did not understand. I really enjoyed the beginning stories. Some of the middle ones were the ones that I was like, oh, I wasn't sure what the author was getting at entirely, and none of that really felt like the author's fault while I was reading. It's a lot. It's very dense. And then it ends with like a longer novella, which I think is the brightest spot of the entire collection. It was very good. It just takes down so many different things, but is based on like higher education. Again, as you're reading it, it's super uncomfortable because you kind of see the bad decisions that the main character is making, but at the same time, all of that like meaning is baked in as he's kind of looking at higher education and all of that. So it's really tough to rate this again because I don't know how much of it just missed me or how much of it is going to take another reading, or if truly this was just so dense or the author kind of lost the thread of it at some point around the middle. So I don't know. I ended up giving this 4 out of 5 stars. So I didn't read a sci-fi book this month, and I also didn't reread anything this month, which rereading something is not really a goal of mine. I just kind of have a slot in there for rereading to try and control myself and really think about the things that I'm rereading. But this month I just didn't reread, and then I tried to finish This Is How You Lose the Time War, which I started in January, but I still haven't finished it. The book that we picked for the House Salt Book Club of February was A Princess in Theory by Alyssa Cole. You can check out the live show, which has already happened, so that you can hear all of our thoughts about this, but I gave it 3.5 out of 5 stars. I really like the main character, Naledi. She is a scientist who is based in New York, and she starts getting these suspicious emails that are basically like, you're engaged to a prince, send your social security number so that you can meet the prince or whatnot. And so she disregards them as spam, obviously, but it turns out it's true. And so the prince ends up in New New York but lies about his identity to meet her, and it kind of goes on from there. I really liked Naledi as a main character, even when the book was telling us that she was closed off and she had a hard time trusting because of things that happened in her past. I just related to her reactions. There were a lot of times where the book was like, she's so closed off, and I was like, no, I understand her. I probably would have reacted in the same way. I thought the beginning half of the book was much stronger than the end half of the book. The end half of the book just completely changes location and pacing, and it just really rushes to this resolution that was like, what? It did not match to me with the rest of the book. There were also some descriptions in the sex scenes that completely took me out of it and were a little uncomfy, if you ask me. But in all, it was pretty enjoyable, and I gave it 3.5 out of 5 stars. Again, if you want to hear all of our thoughts and we go through all of the characters and the plot and the pacing and the sex scenes and all that, you can check out the live show. And we also announced the book that we're going to pick and read for March. It's a super popular book that I feel like a lot of people will be reading, and I will be reading as well. So those were the books that I read specifically to meet some goals, and then there were 2 other books that I just read and picked up just because. First is Such a Fun Age by Kiley Reid. I did a full standalone review of this book that is about a babysitter, a black woman who is babysitting for a white family, and she has the daughter out late at night at the grocery store. Obviously the parents know, but she gets harassed by the security guard who has assumed she has kidnapped this white baby. The whole altercation is caught on camera, and that kind of sets off a series of events, and it changes a little bit her relationship with that family that she is babysitting for, plus she meets somebody that night that she stays in contact with, etc. You watch her go on from there. I really enjoyed this. I think that this was so witty and smart. It was something I was not quite expecting it to be, but it is just a like contemporary coming of age story for Amira, this woman, and it looks at her different relationships within her life, with her friends who are all women of color, with this family who is white and kind of the way that they view her, especially after this incident, and then with this man that she starts dating who is also white, and how all of that comes together. Full feelings in that standalone video, but I gave this 5 out of 5 stars. And the last book that I read in February was Truly Devious by Maureen Johnson. This is the first book in a trilogy, a mystery trilogy, and in this first book we follow a girl named Stevie who is very interested in investigating. She wants to be a detective when she gets older, and so she's been accepted into this very prestigious academy. Basically it's a boarding school that's up in the mountain, and it's a free school that was founded by this billionaire who had this idea to construct the school where very gifted children could come, and like learning would be like playing. Stevie's real purpose though is to be here to investigate a cold case. The billionaire's wife and daughter were kidnapped from the Ellingham estate many years prior to Stevie getting there, so she wants to investigate and see if she can solve this mystery. I will say that I really understand why this has a lot of hype right now, especially since the last book came out. This was incredibly readable. At the very beginning it was too repetitive, and it was trying to set up the characters and the atmosphere in a way that I was like, all right, already, we get it. She likes to investigate. But after that settled in, like the whole idea of like boarding school, all of these kids kind of running around and being very bright and gifted in certain areas, like all of that settled in a way that I found enjoyable. I also thought that the mystery was very gripping. As soon as we were introduced to like the kidnapping in the past, I was like, what happened? So that really pulls you along. There are 2 reasons that I would say don't read this if you are thinking about it. One is if you have a low tolerance for like John Green sorts of teens, and to me it isn't even that they are unrealistic. I don't like to call characters unrealistic, because there will be somebody out there to show up and say, I've met somebody like that. So it's not even that. Here to me it is the way that they are introduced again. So it isn't that they are like super gifted, it's the way that their quirks are almost shoved in your face, where you're like, I get it. They're quirky, they're smart. So that was a little bit annoying. If you have a low tolerance for that, maybe this won't be the book for you. And the other thing that really upset me at the end is that even though I had heard that there is a big overarching mystery that it takes 3 books to solve, but I had heard that like pieces of it get solved in each book, and I don't feel like we got anything at the end of book 1. There's still so many questions left open that it was completely unsatisfying and a cliffhanger at the end of the book. And thankfully, like, all of the books are out now so I can binge them, but truly 3 books to get any answers feels a little bit excessive to me, and I just was really frustrated with the end. There is a little bit of like a love thing going on. The romance isn't super heavy, but the romance, it doesn't start off antagonistic exactly. It just is like he's rude to her in a way that is just kind of like, what is happening here? But then that kind of gets flipped on its head. So whether or not you enjoy that, again, super personal, your tolerance for that thing. I found it a little bit annoying, but it's fine. Overall, I gave this 3.5 out of 5 stars. If you have read or would like to read any of the books that I mentioned here today, let's chat down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you guys soon. I am recording this at 1 o'clock in the morning, so if my makeup looks like makeup that looked good 12 hours ago, that's true. It feels like I'm forgetting a book, but I think that was all of them. I think that was all of them. The first nonfiction book, the third nonfiction